Good morning, everyone. Yeah, Auntie Helena, thank you for clarifying that. I'm sure many people thought it was me, so that needed to be said. But now that that's been dealt with, we can get to the message for today. So thank you once again for coming, and thank you to everyone who's watching online. And you can see behind me a picture of a man, and it's not me. Does anyone know who that is, by any chance? Yeah, thank you, Uncle William. That's why he's the pastor. It's Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And you might recognize it, Uncle William might recognize it then as the name of one of his books. And this title, The Cost of Discipleship, was something that was introduced to me about 5 years ago when I was studying religion at sixth form. And it's something that's always stayed with me. It's one of my favorite lessons of all time, and I think it's very important. So I hope I can share my passion for this subject with you today, and I'll get into why I decided to speak about it today. And in order to do that, Raymond, could you get the next slide up, please? So, as you can see, I've got 3 previous sermons behind me, and I think I was talking to Chris van der Stok about this, about services in general. We were talking about heart, but I think it applies to our general services as well, that it's very easy to go to church on a Sunday, you hear a message, you go home and you forget about it maybe within 1 or 2 days. So what is the lasting impact of these messages if we don't spend time reflecting on them and looking back on them later? And I think we're really lucky to have these YouTube channels. We've got the River South channel, we've got the FFWP UK channel with the North of Thames services, and because it's there and it's available, sometimes I go back and I listen to an old service, especially if I heard it for the first time and thought, wow, there was a lot there and I need to go back, listen to this again so I can really digest this content. And then what I was able to do was combine the lessons that I learned from these 3 different sermons to come up with my own take on some of the topics and people that they covered. So, good morning. So, the first talk there was from Auntie Seagren, and she spoke about adjustment, acceptance, and appreciation. And one person that she brought up was Bonhoeffer, and I thought, I know that guy, he's one of my favorites. I wrote about him when I was applying to university, and I thought, that reminds me of, this lesson, the cost of discipleship and grace, which is something that he spoke about. And those came together also in Auntie Naomi's talk, because she spoke about grace and gratitude. And I thought, there are too many coincidences here. Bonhoeffer talks about grace, and Uncle Jeff, when he spoke, he told us that we should always have a sermon prepared up our sleeve. And I've had this prepared up my sleeve for 5 years. You can go back to the people on my SDF year, and they'll tell you they've probably forgotten about it by now, but I gave my morning inspiration on this topic because it's really interesting to me. And a few years later, I spoke about it to a group of BCs around my age, and I spoke to the brothers on the Brothers in Arms workshop about this topic as well, and looking at identity more specifically. So you can see it's one of my favorites. I like to talk about it every year or two. And I thought, okay, here I'm being given the opportunity to use this sermon that's always been up my sleeve and to combine what Auntie Seagren said and what Auntie Naomi said about Bonhoeffer and grace. So that's why today I'll be talking about discipleship, and I'll also be talking about grace, costly grace versus cheap grace. So I'll get into that more later. And before I move on from Uncle Jeff, I would encourage you, I don't know, you guys, most of you, I don't want to say guys, you people in my community, many of you are older than I am, and I'm sure you've got lots of wisdom that you could share. Maybe there's a sermon up your sleeve as well. I would love to hear it. I'm sure we would all too. So please contact me if there is a sermon up your sleeve. If not, maybe take some time to think about some of the content that you've received and think about how you can maybe recycle it and give your own take on whatever you have received. So thank you, Uncle Jeff, for that. So next, I want to get to discipleship. And as I was researching this topic, I thought, let me do the standard technique of beginning with a definition. So I looked up discipleship, and I looked at what is the definition from its Latin origin. And as you can see, its Latin origin is discipulus, discipulus maybe. I did do Latin at high school, but I can't remember covering this word. And that means learner. So I think it's quite interesting. Maybe in the movement, we don't feel like disciples of true parents. Maybe they feel too far removed. And if we compare ourselves to Jesus's apostles, we think, oh, well, I'm not really in that same position as a disciple to true parents. I'm not that close to them. I'm not within their closest 12 followers. So maybe we don't feel like disciples sometimes. But I would urge you to think that if you are a learner, if you feel like you've learned anything from true parents, then you can consider yourself one of their disciples. And obviously, we don't want to just limit ourselves to what we learn. We want to then act on what we've learned. Otherwise, the lessons that we learn don't have much meaning. They don't go beyond just hearing them and thinking, okay, that's nice. If we want to make a real world difference, then whatever we learn needs to be put into action. So, here I've written about books that we have, such as The Divine Principle and the Chonsong-gyeong. And that's where we can find some of this wisdom. We can learn and better understand what it was that true parents are trying to teach to us and how we can be better disciples, how we can be better learners. And not only do we have the books, the texts, we also have people in our community. So I'm very fortunate to have people in this community that I can learn from. I don't think that we just have to have one disciple that we follow. There are many people that we learn from. So whether that's Uncle William as our pastor, I consider him one of my figures of authority when it comes to education and on spiritual matters. I know he's cringing a little bit there, but it's true. And I can learn from everyone in this community, and we can all learn from each other. So we don't have to have someone that we think has much greater than ourselves in order to learn from them. We can all be disciples of each other, and I think that's an encouraging message to hear. We shouldn't be closed off to hearing and learning from people younger than ourselves. Even Auntie Helena mentioned Anastasia. Anastasia can be quite profound. If you take the time to listen to what she has to say, she's very serious, and she's already got a plan for the future. So, if you want, you can contact her, ask her if she's willing to let you become one of her disciples. I'm sure she'll be up here in no time giving the next sermon. We can learn from people, not just texts. And eventually, our aim as a movement that's trying to create one family under God and spread our wisdom to others is to make a real world impact and share our truth, not just keeping it to ourselves. So, if we are taking that role and we embrace the responsibility of spreading our truth, then that puts us in this leadership position. And I recently attended this leadership conference for people who lead church services or help out with their congregation. And that was organized by the Holy Trinity Brompton Church and also the Alpha Course. And that was a great opportunity. And unfortunately, I couldn't bring more people from the community there. So I thought, well, at least if I couldn't bring people there physically, I can share what I learned at the next service. So that's what I've decided to do. And one of the main points that they made here was that leadership is equal to influence. So if you have influence over anyone, going back to what it means to be a disciple, disciples follow a leader, right? So that leader has influence on their disciples. So if you have influence on anyone in your life, whether it's your children or it's a friend, it could be anyone in your life, a colleague. If you have a form of influence over them, you see that they change because of the way they interact with you and what you can communicate with them, then that makes you a leadership, a figure, what's a nice word? A leader in their life. You can lead them towards something better. You can influence them in a positive way that can lead to them becoming a better person, or just being happier even. That would be good. I would settle for that. And when I was thinking about this process of leadership, I thought everyone starts off as fairly ignorant, right? We don't have all of this knowledge when we're born, but when we grow up, we mature, and we learn from many people around us, our teachers at school, our parents at home, our older siblings, and we no longer are lost in this state of ignorance. We become a learner. And it's good to learn, but eventually that learning needs to be put into action. And so we need to become teachers. We need to have our own disciples, people who follow us. And I think this period between learning and teaching isn't so fixed. As we're learning, we can teach. We don't have to feel, oh, I'm an expert on this topic and now I can teach about it. I'm definitely not an expert on grace or Bonhoeffer, but I'm still here trying to teach you all about him. And I feel that we shouldn't feel unworthy or unqualified to speak about topics just because we're not the highest authority on that subject. So I think the relationship between learning and teaching is very active. There's a lot of give and take going on there. And I think the best way to learn is by teaching. So to teach you about Bonhoeffer today, I had to go and do some research and learn more, and to feel, okay, even if I'm not going to be fully qualified, at least a little bit more qualified than I was at the start of the week. And I think if you have any topic in mind that you think, oh, I would like to learn about that more, maybe approach it from the perspective of I would be happy if I could teach someone else about this. But in order to get to that stage, I need to learn more about it myself first. So I think that's quite a nice way to approach learning and teaching, thinking that your learning is not just for you, you can share that with others. And I don't know if you've seen Karate Kid, but that's a meme from Karate Kid. Well, actually, it's not a meme, it's more of a quote. And it says, there's Mr. Miyagi, he's talking, right, to Daniel-san. And he says, there's no such thing as a bad student, there's only a bad teacher. So if we look around us and we feel that, there's a lot of evil in this world, a lot of wrongdoing, then we have to think, why is all this evil so prevalent in our society, in our environment? And it's because the people who have influenced the people who are doing evil weren't great influences. So if we can be better influences, then we won't have these bad students who are doing bad things, if that makes sense. And it's not the students' fault. They can only learn from the people around them, from their own leaders. But if they don't have good leaders or good teachers, then it's going to be very difficult for them to ascend that low level of morality. So I would urge you all to try to be good teachers, and then we'll see more good students around us. We can all be like Mr. Miyagi. If you take one thing away from this talk, it's be more like Mr. Miyagi. He's a legend. Anyway, with that being said, I would like to move on to this relationship between cheap grace and costly grace. So I alluded to this earlier, and Auntie Naomi spoke about grace and gratitude. So in her talk, she spoke about how we can express our gratitude for our grace. And when I was thinking back on this, I thought there are two main ways that I feel I could show God I'm grateful for the grace that you have given me. And the first one Auntie Naomi spoke about was sharing it with those around us. If we have this grace, if it's really filling us up, we don't want to just hold it down, right? We want to share this grace to everyone around us and not just keep it to ourselves. If it really is that moving and it really can have such a large impact. And then the second point, which is more connected to what Bonhoeffer teaches, is that we can try to deserve it. So when it comes to grace, I know the whole concept is it's something that we can't deserve. It's something that God gives to us, and we can never do anything to justify receiving God's grace, but because God is so loving, he gives it to us anyway. And that may be true. That certainly is true, I think. I don't feel like I have done anything or I could do anything in my life where I feel entitled to say, yeah, God, I deserve your grace, give it to me. It's God's decision at the end of the day. But I would feel a bit more able to accept God's grace if I felt that I had done something to deserve it. You know, if you receive a gift or a compliment, if you feel that you don't deserve the compliment, it can be a bit awkward. You feel, no, I don't deserve that. Please don't say that. I didn't actually do a good job, whatever it is. But if you feel, actually, maybe it wasn't the perfect job, but I did my best. So thank you for acknowledging that. And you can take that compliment on board and accept it more easily. And I think there's a similar relationship when it comes to how God wants to give us grace. So Bonhoeffer, he speaks about cheap grace, and this is what he has to say. I'm going to read it out. Cheap grace is the preaching of forgiveness without requiring repentance, baptism without church discipline, communion without confession, absolution without personal confession. Cheap grace is grace without discipleship, grace without the cross, grace without Jesus Christ, living and incarnate. So Bonhoeffer here is pointing out that we can receive grace. Because God is loving, we will all receive grace ultimately at the end. But he's labeling it cheap because we're not paying any price in order to receive this grace. We're just receiving it because God is loving, but not because we're doing anything to deserve it. And I think here Bonhoeffer is challenging us to take up our own cross and to be willing to experience some form of hardship in order to deserve his grace, to struggle for God, to fight for him. And I find that when I sacrifice more for God, that I feel that my relationship with God is better. If God can't see that I'm investing into my relationship with him, then it's just a one-sided relationship and it's not really growing or developing in any way. It's the same as any relationship, really. It's not just your relationship with God. It requires some investment. It requires some hard work. Otherwise, your relationship isn't going to be that strong. It's not going to be that meaningful. Conversely, when Bonhoeffer talks about costly grace, he says this: such grace is costly because it calls us to follow, and it is grace because it calls us to follow Jesus Christ. It is costly because it costs a man his life, and it is grace because it gives a man the only true life. It is costly because it condemns sin, and grace because it justifies the sinner. Costly grace confronts us as a gracious call to follow Jesus. It comes as a word of forgiveness to the broken spirit and the contrite heart. Grace is costly because it compels a man to submit to the yoke of Christ and follow him. It is grace because Jesus says, "My yoke is easy and my burden is light." So that might seem a little paradoxical. You're thinking, how can struggling become easy? But I think not easy, but how can I be willing to sacrifice? Because obviously when we think of struggling and pain, that's naturally off-putting. We have to overcome some sort of barrier in order to become willing to go through these hardships. And I think the last line there is the key to how we can do this. If we relate to our teachers, if that's Jesus or true parents or whoever we consider to be a central figure in our lives, our confidence, our faith in our leaders will give us the ability to lighten our loads because we feel it's not just on us. Look, here's an example of someone who probably struggled more than I did. For Christians, they can look to Jesus and they think, it doesn't matter how much I struggled, I will never come close to struggling as much as Jesus did. So the fact that Jesus went through all of this suffering and died for my sins and to bring me salvation means that even if I can't match Jesus' level of sacrifice, I don't have an excuse not to sacrifice myself as well and to work hard and to experience these hardships. And I feel that we need to have authorities like Jesus and these figures who we see working hard and we think, look, there's a role model for me. There's an example. And I want to be more like him, or I want to be more like her. And if we look at true parents, I think we have a good example there. True fathers struggled way too much. I can't imagine struggling as much as true fathers struggled or true mothers struggled. But the fact that they went through that struggle gives us the confidence and almost gives us a reason to struggle just as much. Because if you have a leader who's telling you to do something that you don't think he or she would do him or herself, you often call that out. You think, oh, that's a bit hypocritical, right? How can you tell me what to do when I know you wouldn't do that? But when you have a leader who shows you that he or she is willing to go the extra mile for you, then you feel almost compelled to give it back to them, to think, you start thinking, well, I have no excuses now and I can't, instead of just getting lost in your criticism and thinking, oh, you're a hypocrite, you're not given that excuse to not stand up and work hard. However, I think it's important when we start looking at costly grace and cheap grace not to become critical of others. I'm not here to criticize you and say, oh, your grace is cheap and my grace is costly. That's foolish. I wouldn't do that. I think each person's relationship with grace is unique, and that's for each person to figure out. All I can do today is encourage you to take a different approach or continue taking the same approach that you're taking now. I have no idea about your relationship with grace, but I'm just sharing my thoughts and what I find valuable to me. And I think Bonhoeffer also warns against judgment and focusing on your own grace. So he says this: judging others makes us blind, whereas love is illuminating. By judging others, we bind ourselves to our own evil and to the grace which others are just as entitled to as we are. So, yeah, this solidifies the point I'm making, that everyone is entitled to grace. You might feel that you deserve it more, but that's your own life, that's your own journey. It's not for you to point fingers at other people and say, you don't deserve grace as much as I do. Why aren't you doing as much as I am? I think, if anything, I mean, you will still get your grace, but I think God will be less willing to give it to you. It's backwards, I think. You're not really thinking about grace in the right way if you start thinking that you're entitled to it. And it doesn't help to compare yourself to others. As I was preparing for this sermon, I was doing my Bible condition, and a couple of quotes stood out to me this week, and I wanted to share them with you because I think they relate quite nicely to this concept of grace and the different dangers that we can face and the different temptations that come up. So the first one is from Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 28. And this, I labeled it the cycle of complacency. I think it's quite poetic. Proud of that one. And this is what it says: "But as soon as they were at rest, they again did what was evil in your sight. Then you abandoned them to the hand of their enemies, so that they ruled over them. And when they cried out to you again, you heard from heaven, and in your compassion you delivered them time after time." So, I'm reading through the Bible now. I started at the beginning and I've just finished the book of Esther yesterday. And one thing that's becoming abundantly clear is that the Jews faced many, many setbacks and many lapses in concentration and in faith. And as it says time and again, God had to forgive the Jews and show them compassion and give them a way of returning to him. And whenever they were able to open up and admit that they had done wrong and that they were seeking his forgiveness, God was willing to give them that forgiveness. God was willing to bestow his grace upon them. But when I read this excerpt, I get a sense of God's frustration. Why do I have to do this again and again and again? And I think it's because of this cycle of complacency. Because when things are bad, you turn to God. And you think, oh, God, help me. I'm really struggling. I need your help. And then when things aren't as bad and you don't feel as dependent on God, it's easy to neglect our relationship with him. And we no longer feel such a great need for his grace because we think, oh, my life is going well. I can just do what I want to do. And maybe I'll let other evil influences direct and control the way I behave. And I'm gradually going to forget what it is that I'm trying to uphold or that my ancestors upheld. But that's becoming less and less important to me. And it's this whole cycle of strong times create weak men, and weak men create hard times create strong men. I'm sure you've heard it many times before, but I think it's true when it comes to our relationship with grace as well. If we're being tortured or we're in extreme difficulty, nearly everyone turns to God or turns to someone and is looking for help. But if we're not, and we're settled and we're comfortable, and we're not really making much progress, or we're not growing much, it's easy to stay in that condition of complacency and being happy with where you are. But if you're not growing, you're not going to experience the pains that come with growth. So I would say that if you are very comfortable and very settled and becoming complacent, that probably shows that your growth is stagnating a bit as well. You could always push yourself to grow and develop more, and you will experience growing pains along the way, but at least you can take that as evidence that you are maturing and developing. So the next quote I have is also from Nehemiah. This is actually from a bit earlier, and before I read it out, I want to give it some context. So Nehemiah was given permission to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem after the Jews were exiled. And when he was rebuilding the walls, some of the enemies of the Jews were upset that Jerusalem was being built up once again. And they made a plan, or they came up with a plot to assassinate him. And so someone catches wind of this, and they go to Nehemiah to say, look, people are trying to kill you. What are you going to do about it? And he recommends Nehemiah to go to the temple because he thinks he'll be safe in the temple. Maybe they won't assassinate him in the house of the Lord. Or maybe he can hide there. And this is Nehemiah's response. He says, but I said, should a man like me run away? Or should someone like me go into the temple to save his life? I will not go. And I thought this is really powerful. Nehemiah here, he's fighting for what's right, and he's not depending on God. He's not going to the temple and asking God to protect him and just hide away from his enemies. He would rather confront his enemies outside the temple of God. And in that way, he can protect God's house, God's dwelling, because he's not inviting that danger to the temple and saying, okay, hopefully I'll be safe here. But by being there, he's inviting the evil to come in there as well. But he doesn't want to depend on God. He wants to fight for what's right. He wants to fight for God. And instead of, you could think of, okay, let me give an example, a modern example. If you think of the Cheonwon-gung, right? That's a temple that we've been celebrating recently. Imagine there was some sort of attack, a terrorist attack on the Cheonwon-gung, and you had the choice of the attack. If you found out that the terrorists were coming for you, would you want to go hide inside the temple that's cost God knows how much to build and invite that danger to come in there, and maybe the house gets destroyed and has to be rebuilt? Or would you rather confront the terrorists outside the building and protect God's house from being destroyed? And I know that sounds really extreme, but that image came to my mind when I was reading this text. I thought, yeah, why would I force God to deal with my problems or with the evils that are facing me in my life? I would rather be able to confront it outside and then come back to God when I'm in a better state, without bringing all of this danger with me, but being able to go to God in out of a desire to serve him, not to just receive his grace and his protection, but go to God or go to church with the attitude that I want to give something to my community, instead of thinking, oh, I hope that it can protect me and keep me safe. I hope that makes sense. So, I'll get to my summary now. And the first point I want to make is that value is determined by how much you're willing to pay. So I'm sure you've thought about this, maybe not in such an explicit way, but if you think about the price of petrol, for example, the price of petrol is dependent on how much people are willing to pay. So if it becomes more scarce, people might be willing to pay more, and if there's a new reserve of oil that's discovered, it might become cheaper. But it's up to us, the consumer, how much anything is valued. So when it comes to grace, how much we value grace is up to us. If we really value grace, then we would be willing, as it says in my next point, to sacrifice more for it. But if we decide that it's fine, I'll just receive grace and carry on doing what I'm doing, okay, that doesn't apply if you're already doing a lot, but if you get what I mean, if you just don't do much but think, okay, I'll receive it anyway, then the grace won't be as valuable to you as it would be for somebody who's sacrificed more for it. So, does anyone remember what I spoke about last time when I gave a sermon? It's not a test. I'm just interested to see. Yeah, becoming a super barbarian. So I've got a little. Oh, it fell down. All right. So when I finished the super barbarian, I got this cap, and I like wearing caps. You know, they can keep the sun out of my eyes. But if I just bought this cap from the shop for £10, I would like it. I'd still think it's a nice cap, and I would probably wear it. But the fact that I had to go through some sort of struggle to get this cap makes it a lot more meaningful to me. Every time I put it on, I'm reminded of the sacrifice and effort that I invested into this challenge. And so it's not just a cap to me. I could walk down the street, no one would know the significance of this cap. But wearing the cap, I feel, wow, yeah, I did that. I sacrificed a lot for this, and now I can enjoy this cap. It's a lot more meaningful to me. But yeah, like I said, if I just bought it from the shop, I might still think it's a nice cap, and I hope you get the connection here. Grace might still be nice, but it's going to mean a lot more to you if you sacrifice and invested to get that grace. So yeah, remember the cap, no cap. And yeah, what else did I want to say? I think I kind of touched on this already. If you want to have a real impact on the world, we need to move beyond being disciples in order to become leaders. And I think we all have the capacity to become leaders. You don't need to be a certain age. You don't need to have certain qualifications to be a leader. Like I said earlier, you just need to have influence. And if you can be a good influence on someone, you can be a good teacher, they will become a good student. And I think that's our responsibility. We want to have a good influence on this world. We want to have a real impact. And the only way we can have impact is through our influence. And if our influence is good, then we'll see the benefits in the people that we are impacting. And yeah, just a reminder, do not get complacent and do not hide away in God's temple. Our responsibility is to fight for God and defend his house by putting our knowledge into action. We need to know our own value, and we must stand up for our beliefs. And yeah, this point reminds me of something that my dad likes to say to me and my siblings. He likes to say that if you don't know your own value, no one else will. So if we don't know our own value as members of the Unification movement, as first gen, second gen, or third gen even, then nobody else is going to recognize that value for us. If we don't think there's something special, there's something unique, or there's something precious about being part of this movement, nobody's going to come and tell us, oh, wow, I think you guys have something really nice to share, and you've got something really special. I'd like to find out more. If we don't believe that, nobody else is going to believe it. So we need to internalize our own value and think, yes, we have something valuable, and it is worth sharing with other people. And if other people see, wow, that person, he or she really gets a lot from being part of this community, or I can see he's doing all these great things, I wonder what motivates him, then they'll find the time and a reason to figure out what your value is and where it comes from. So I think we need to be aware of our own value. I think that's really, really important. And I hope that after this service, you can feel a bit more encouraged and bold about our value as members of this community and the impact that we could have and that we are already having. And lastly, we should embrace any difficulties that we encounter while spreading our truth. For this is the cost of discipleship. And I hope I've made it clear today that this cost of discipleship is nothing to be afraid of. We have true parents, we have each other, we have Jesus, we have all these people who we can turn to and we can work together with. And even if we feel like our burden is heavy, by turning to each other and to true parents and to Jesus, we can make our burden light. And I think together, if we're all paying some price, then it becomes easier for us as a community to pay the collective price. If it's just one person paying the price or two people, it's a lot more expensive for those two people. If we spread the cost, it'll be more manageable, and I think we can still receive the same results. So yeah, that's basically it from my message. Just before I leave, I wanted to say that there's a lot more to this book, The Cost of Discipleship, than what I was able to convey to you today. Bonhoeffer talks about his relationship with Jesus and how there should be nothing that gets in the way of that relationship. And there's a lot more truth and wisdom in this book, so I can highly recommend it. And yeah, I'll finish with that. Thank you.